So here's a guide to playing the bass, a minimal guide to get you out playing, and then you can learn things like the intricate riffs and solos and things afterwards. Very often people playing the bass kind of get it the wrong way round, so they're learning all this complicated stuff, but at the same time find it difficult to keep a beat. So you will be working with the drummer almost exclusively. So this, just a brief history of this. This is the precision bass, which was designed in 1950 to outmode the double bass, which was becoming hard to hear in a big orchestra, and a double bass was also hard to carry. You needed a lot of very, very precise technique to play the double bass. With this, all the notes are laid out with frets, unlike the double bass, hence the name precision. So we've got the right hand plucking the strings. You have to use alternate fingers. Index finger, middle, index, middle, index, middle. Keeping them straight like this with your thumb braced on the pickup, and then you can just play a note by just dragging your finger across the string instead of plucking. You get a not very nice sound like that. That has much more clean sort of tone to it. Now, because your fingers are essentially in different places on the string, you're going to get a slightly different sound with the fingers, with each finger. And actually, that's quite a good thing, because then you can drive that rhythm along. Now, from the outset, it's a good idea to jam with a drummer if you can, or the next best thing, a drum machine. So if you've got GarageBand on an iOS device, something like this. Now you have to warm up with this. I was slightly out of time there. If you play out of time with a drummer, actually the band will not gel at all. So really trying to focus in on that drum beat. So practicing a lot of clapping along with a beat or working out where beat 1 is and just basically feeling that beat is a really good start to playing the bass, because you really do need that. Something of that sort. Now, I was playing on G there. That's 3rd fret on the string that's closest to you, the E string. The 4th string, I know it's confusing. 1st string is actually that one. The 4th is this, but let's just name them after the strings. You've got the E string and you're playing a G. Now, with the left hand, you have to make sure that you're playing right up against the fret rather than here, where you get that sort of buzzing because the string is not fully touching the fret. The string will only resonate if it's touching a piece of metal at each end. You've got a piece of metal this end, piece of metal here. Keep the pressure held on this finger until you're ready to stop the note. Stopping the notes. You can do it with your right hand or your left hand, or both, ideally. And you can either do that by lifting the note off or putting another finger over it. And being able to stop it with the minimum of noise on the note finish as well, so you don't want this. So, other notes on the fretboard, you have G at 3rd fret, A at 5th, B at 7th. Next string, you have the C at 3, then the D, and then the E, and F is at the bottom here. So that means you've got all 7 natural notes from A to G. So remembering where they are is a really important thing to start with. You can do all the sharps and flats afterwards. Flat is 1 fret that way, sharp is 1 fret that way. So G sharp is there at 4th. Also confusingly known as A flat. So you have to be able to read both of those. A flat and G sharp are actually on the same fret. So I was going from G to G sharp there. Now with the right hand, it's important if you're playing the G and the D strings, for example, to actually make sure that these two strings aren't going to sound. If I just do this, you can hear all of that noise in the background. The way to do that is to mute the first two strings. You could do it with your thumb. So if I'm going to be playing the top string, I could put my thumb on the A string with the back of my thumb on the E string. So I'm just holding them like that. Now the D string is the only one that's left open, but if I play the G and bring my finger to rest on the D string, I'm actually holding three strings silently. A lot of problems arise from these sort of muddy sort of bass frequencies, and it can really cloud a mix if you're recording, or you can, on stage, it's just muddy and confusing if you've got all that in the background. So with that, I'm just taking care. That was a riff that used all four strings. When you're playing this string here, the bottom string, the E string, notice that I had my left hand just covering these strings just to make sure that they wouldn't resonate either. So it's all a bit of a minefield, this. You've just got to really concentrate on getting only one note at a time on the bass. Most of the time you can play chords, but most of the time you'd be playing single notes, keeping things simple. If you're maybe on a gig and you're doing, I don't know, a 12-bar blues or something, or let's say a Brown Eyed Girl. It's in G, and there are two other notes, C and D, for the verse. Hey, where did we go? Hey, when the rains came down in a hollow, playing a new game. Three notes there. The three chord trick, as it's sometimes known. Actually, in Brown Eyed Girl, there's an E minor as well, which is just an E. Or that. Notice that I've shown you where some of the notes are. You can get notes everywhere else on the bass as well. If I've got a G here, I can get another G by going across two strings and up 2 frets. And I get the next octave up. And that happens wherever you are on the bass. So if I've got an F here, I'll have another F there. Now, conveniently, the other note that you would use in addition to your main note is called the fifth, which is 1 string and 2 frets away. So even with the simplicity of the notes, you can create a rhythm that's a little bit more complicated just to make things drive along. So if I play with the drums again, so I've got something that's based on F, but it's a bit more exploratory. It's not just... Although that in itself is very hard to keep going. Keeping eighth notes or quavers going. Make them sound regular is actually really tricky. You might find that a bit boring, but actually what you're doing as a bass player or any other instrumentalist apart from the singer, really, is you are playing for the song. You're not playing necessarily for your own sort of ends with things like sort of... you have to listen to what the song's about, what the vocals are doing, and what the upper parts are playing, like a lead guitar part or a brass line or whatever, and you have to play to that. Like Sitting on the Dock of the Bay, for example. Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes. That would sound better than this. Sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes. They're completely disjointed, whereas sitting in the morning sun, I'll be sitting when the evening comes. That just grooves much better. That's a buzzword here, is whether it grooves or not, or whether it's in the pocket, as drummers sometimes refer to, where you've got this groove that just sounds really nice and just constant time with some little rhythmic intricacies and subtleties. So just if I go slightly slower on this drum beat, it becomes even harder to get these eighth notes, and it's well worth slowing a drum beat down so that you can play really basic stuff but in time. So that was at 50 something beats per minute, and you're trying to keep quavers going. It's surprisingly difficult to do that. And actually, if you can do it in time, and you'll be able to play with a drummer and the band will sound good. Ginger Baker once said, if you've got a bad drummer and a bad bass player, you've got a bad band. And he's absolutely right. If the bass player and the drummer are really locked in and playing for the song, everything else is just going to work. It's just going to sit on top of that nicely. So, with the sound quality, you have to aim to try and play really 70% of maximum volume. You don't want to do that because it just sounds really strained. If you play too quietly, you'll hear more finger noise than you will the note. You get much better sustain from the string, and that's one thing that this has that the double bass doesn't have, is sustain. So you can play a note like this and it will last a good few seconds. So there are other techniques with the right hand, like slap bass and the sort of disco era and stuff like that. It's very easy to get stuck into that, just playing slap bass and trying to play things as fast as you can. But if I just get that drum rhythm back, let's speed the tempo up very slightly, because it sounds a little bit false at that speed with the sounds on GarageBand. But if I bring that loop back up, I get this. There were a few things there that weren't quite in time with that drum beat, so you've got to be really careful. Now, how I did that slap bass thing was I used the side of my thumb and I hit the string, and really my thumb is acting as a piano hammer, where the hammer comes towards the string and it just has enough energy to touch the string before returning to a rest position with the key pressed down. Same thing happens with the bass. So I've got this. So you see on that camera there. My thumb actually ends up resting above the string. If the thumb touches the string, you'll just kill the note. Now, it's best with the slap thing to actually do it quite quietly. If you do it too hard, you get that horrible sort of popping sound, which is part of it, but you don't want it to be too severe. You've also got to make sure your pickups are adjusted, because if you hit a string hard enough, it might touch the pole piece. You can kill a speaker doing that, so you've got to be a bit careful. Now, with my other finger, it could be my index finger or my middle finger. I tend to use my middle finger, where I actually pluck the string, and the string snaps back against the frets, creating that sort of percussive sound. So I can get those sort of doubles going with my thumb, a bit like a double bass drum, where the first of the thumbs is actually quite quiet and the second one is your main. And it always works best if you're quite quiet with it. If you want more volume, you just crank your amp up. It should always be relaxed, so that means that you can resolve what you're doing to the drum beat. Now, I'm also doing some other techniques here where I'm actually doing a hammer on. So if I play a note and then I basically play another note but without plucking again. Now you have to be quite forceful with the left hand, otherwise you get buzzing. Like that. And also the energy of that second note will disappear. So the second note had almost the same volume as the first one. And you can do the opposite, you can do a pull, which is a little bit more subtle, in that the second note is basically a bit quieter. You can pluck with this, but you've got to also be careful that your note doesn't change pitch when you're doing that. So you can do these things in conjunction with your slap bass, with your right hand, to create something that's rhythmically quite complicated, but actually physically you're dividing the work between the hands. Just aligning those fingers together. So all of this, though, is really genre specific and that sort of disco, funky, sort of jazz funk thing. But when you're playing rock and pop tunes, if you listen to anything that's around at the moment, the bass parts are generally very simple, but executed perfectly in time, in rhythmic sense. So you don't want to get all too complicated with, you know, here we go, here with the brains came. It just sounds ridiculous. Hey, where did we go? It allows the vocalist to express and to have that sort of dynamic range over a very solid bass and drums. So once you know where the notes are on the bass, G, A, B, C, D, E, and then F down the bottom here. Once you know where those notes are, you can just read a chord sequence and just keep a beat. B, C, D, F, E, A. Notice I played E as an open string there because the chord I specified after F was E, and they're next to each other. It sounds a bit false if you're going G, F, E. There's this sudden change in octave there, which can be unsettling for the general groove of it. So there is an introduction to playing the bass, and in the next program I'm going to show you about scales and how you can actually interpolate between notes, which is something that should be done occasionally, but it just makes things gel a bit nicer if you're going from one chord to another, and the bass player's job is often to imply what the next chord is going to be.